Hi, my name is Alexandra Frantischek Jack, and I'm here with the Decorative Arts Trust to give you a tour of the exhibition I curated, A Room of Her Own, the Estrado in the Hispanic World. Here in the Hispanic Society in Upper Manhattan, we are in the main court, and I'm excited that you guys are here with us today. So just to begin with a little overview of the Estrado, the term Estrado is no longer used in this sense in modern day Spanish. It means, like a political platform or something like a witness stand in a court. So even today, most native Spanish speakers are not familiar with this space or the term Estrado, which is one of the most compelling reasons why I decided to explore this topic, because it seems like it had just completely disappeared. And the origins are very mysterious. We believe it originated in Islamic Al-Andalus in the late Middle Ages in the southern Iberian Peninsula. And it begins as a space that is more like a drawing room for men and women, elite men and women. And it doesn't become codified as an exclusively female space until about the 15th century. And then it spreads to the Americas, and it really takes off as you have this huge influx of different materials and wealth, and that's kind of what this exhibition celebrates. And so we can begin here with our period room. It's not meant to specifically represent an estrado at a certain point in time or geographic location, but it's the Hispanic Society's interpretation of an estrado, and it will give you kind of an introduction of what this space would have been like. So we begin with the tarima, which is a platform, which is kind of a nod back to its origins in Islamic Spain. When the estrado first emerges, you don't really have that much specialized furniture. So women would be sitting on these platforms with a lot of cushions, dozens of cushions, based on these inventories that I was able to look at. You see like 12 to 24 cushions imported from China, made of silk and velvet. So it's really incredible to see how this would have been a very textile heavy space. And of course you would have at least one carpet. The carpet rug making industry in Spain was very rich. Two of the main centers of manufacture were Alcaraz and Cuenca, and this is an example from Cuenca. So the Hispanic Society has about 750,000 pieces in its collection. So I was able to go using dowries and inventories and texts from the period to sort of curate and cultivate a sense of what exactly would have been in different estrados based on all of these original sources. And so I chose this specific example. A lot of these pieces have never been on view before, which is really exciting. This specific example from Cuenca, because there is a text by a Spanish writer named Juan de Zavaleta from the 17th century who describes an estrado with a green rug that is so ornate and so beautiful, it reminds him of a garden. And then next to this, or on top of this rug actually, this green carpet that he describes in this estrado, was a brazier that was so elaborate that it reminded him of a fountain in a garden. So I was trying to kind of convey that sense with these pieces that we very luckily happen to have in our collection. And of course, the brazier would have been like a portable fireplace to keep you warm in the Spanish world. And pretty much everything you see here is from our permanent collection. The one piece we have on loan very generously is from Robert Simon Gallery on the Upper East Side here in New York. And it is a 18th century mother of pearl inlaid estrado table or side table. It's actually one of a pair, and it's absolutely spectacular with the very ornate inlaid design. And it likely would have been made in Guatemala or Peru in the 18th century for export in Peru. So there's a lot of different furnishings in this style with this encrusted mother of pearl that come out of Peru. So it's just really incredible to see, the kinds of pieces that would have been in the estrado. And then behind it, we have this cabinet from Goa. And one of the really compelling things also about the Estrado is that it was really entrenched in the collecting practices and female artistic patronage. So you have all of these incredible objects that are often the most expensive that you see in the inventories, all associated with these female spaces, which is really fascinating because it's something that people don't really know about. But oftentimes, some of the most luxurious and opulent items in the home would have been specifically devoted to the Estrado. So, and we have pieces coming in from all over the world, like, for example, Goa, with these incredible mermaids at the bottom, and the different inlays of precious wood and ivory. And women would have stored lots of jewelry and little items in these cabinets. So it's just part of the incredible array of objects that you find in the Estrado. And then here we have a cabinet from the 17th century from Oaxaca, Mexico. And here we have a great combination of German influence in the form. This style was very popular. It probably originated, the style itself originated in Nuremberg or Augsburg in Germany. And wealthy Spaniards would have brought these desks, these fall front desks from Germany to the Americas with them. And then mestizo or indigenous craftsmen working in these workshops in Mexico would have adapted the form using an indigenous technique and material called zulaque. And then they would incise these incredible decoration that was likely inspired by Flemish engravings. So you have, the rich, really rich print culture that's coming about during this time, this early modern time period, and influencing indigenous crafts. So I hate the term hybrid, but it's a really great example of like these hybrid decorative art forms that are coming about that are really, I think, very unique to the Spanish Americas and something that I really try to celebrate in this exhibition. And going back to the idea of collecting practices in the Spanish world associated with the Estrado, these are just some examples of the different kinds of objects that you might find in an Estrado. We have a turkey incense burner, which is very charming. And some of these materials that you would have found in the Estrado would, again, have been very expensive. We have tortoiseshell with silver mounts, a little casket. And then we have a barniz de pasto lacquer box with all sorts of designs on it. And clearly influenced by Japanese lacquer, but would have been made using an indigenous technique from Colombia and northern Peru, like basically the jungle areas of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And essentially, the two craftsmen would take this lacquer from the resin of the mopa mopa tree, and then they would pull it kind of like taffy and knead it and chew it, and until it was soft enough, and then they would coat the piece of wood underneath, probably usually like a European style furniture form, and then that would create this incredible material that would also be conveniently weatherproof and water resistant, which is obviously something you need for this kind of climate. So it's really interesting how, again, these combinations of Asian, European, and indigenous practices all kind of coalesce in these luxury objects that would have been on display in the Estrado. And then in these cabinets that you have in the Estrado called escaparates, they are very similar to what you see in Europe in terms of the Kunstkammer and the Wunderkammer, the curiosity cabinet. So you have a mixture of these exotic materials, but also really great examples of refinement in terms of technique, and not just objects that are of intrinsic value, but also just things that are really interesting to look at. And using our incredible rare books collection, I was able to find lots of Golden Age literature that describes these cabinets and these curiosities that you would have found in the Estrado. And so there's multiple sources. There's also travel writing from visitors from France and England who are encountering these estrados, and they list the objects. So it's really cool to be able to kind of pinpoint and bring everything together. For the first time, really, there hasn't been a show like this on this topic before, which is always mind-blowing to me. And as I mentioned before, again, very textile heavy, especially the earlier estrados. The most common type of pillow that you would have seen in the estrado, based on the textual sources that still survive, is this kind of red velvet with gold embroidery and gold fringe pillow. And this example we have here is actually quite old. It's from the 15th century, and underneath there is a text that refers to the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary, and in Latin it says, "I am the handmaiden of the Lord." So we we make the educated guess that it was likely used and produced for a woman for prayer. And before we have the fall front desks, we have these chests that clearly incorporate Islamic techniques. This kind of ivory inlay with the diamond shapes is called taracera in Spanish, which comes from the word tarsi in Arabic, meaning incrustation. And here women would have stored their needlework. They would have closed the chest and had their servants bring them their food. And they have there are written accounts that describe these women sitting here all day with their needlework and, you know, eating and dining with these small pieces of furniture in front of them, and sort of using that as a place to store, but also as a functional piece of furniture. And these are just examples of other objects that might have been displayed in the estrado and also used. This is a pilgrim flask, which would have likely been given as a gift for a wedding. And you see a little 16th century man and woman together holding hands. And was probably actually one of a pair, but we have the one. And this is Barcelona glass, which was very desired during this period. And here we cross over to the Americas. In my research, one of the most exciting things that I found was actually that among the earliest adopters that we have evidence of in the Americas of the estrado would have been elite Inca women. And here is a reproduction of a book that was written or published in 1615 that describes contact between the Europeans and the indigenous people. And the translated text that refers to these women, these elite women, with their estrados goes as follows. These are the great ladies of the kingdom who are the wives of the principal and second persons, or their sisters and daughters or granddaughters. They have an estrado rug pillow, and they have to differentiate their entire caste from the common Indians. So it's really interesting how this becomes part of the status symbols that's very much embraced by these indigenous women, the Inca elite women in the Andes as early as the early 17th century. So pretty exciting. And here, these are from our rare books collection. And this particular engraving, it's from a book by Amédée Francois Fraisier, who was an envoy for King Louis XIV. And he describes in great detail, it's actually one of the best sources that we have on the estrado, where he describes how men had to be expressly invited into the estrado. They could not enter unless they were invited by the women. And here we see actually a woman drinking mate on a chest, kind of like the one that I showed you earlier. And there's paintings of angels from the archangels from the Cusco school in the background. So very detailed, talks about women playing music there, dining, their coca leaves, just kind of, the practices that they would have had, that would have taken place in the estrado. And Right behind it, we have some examples. Again, this is supposed to represent the Viceroyalty of Peru. Some examples of the incredible silver objects that you would have seen in the Estrado in the Viceroyalty of Peru. We have different mate cups, which the form is adapted from the original, the indigenous Guarani people who cultivated the mate, the yerba mate. And it's kind of an homage to the form of this incised gourd. And then here is the bombilla, which is a kind of straw that would filter the mate leaves. And once again, here we see a very rich combination of indigenous and European influences and techniques. In the silver, we have the sacred Inca flower here that's represented. We have this tea kettle that would have been filled with hot coals and kept right below boiling, and then you would serve the water for your mate. And here, this was probably a place to store sweets or perhaps mate. And we have this absolutely gorgeous tray that was actually part of the collection of Queen Charlotte, and it has her stamp in the back, and it has flowers and also chinchillas. So again, combination of different influences and techniques, and the region itself was very, very rich because of the mines that were exploited by the Spanish, but had been had been worked for many, many, many years beforehand. And the indigenous peoples of this region had a very, very rich precious metalwork tradition. For instance, if you look at like Moche, the Chimu peoples had a very, very rich tradition of silver. And a lot of these pieces would have been melted down and then used to produce these new wares for Spanish consumers and criollo, like American-born Spaniard consumers. And there's, a big lore that's associated with Potosi, which was the biggest mine. It was considered the treasury of the world. And so, very likely some of these pieces may have been sourced from the Potosi mines. So it really lent itself to the rich silver pieces in the region that you see in the engravings on the other side. And you can't talk about the Hispanic world without talking about Catholicism. So this was very entrenched in what would have taken place in the Estrado. The Estrado also was a place where women would educate their children. They would practice, their daily devotion. And one of the things that I also was really interested in when I was researching the show was whether the Estrado represented a place of confinement and constraint, or if it was like a place where, possible subversion. I was trying really hard not to impose a 21st century lens where I was really looking for some subversion and, some, semblance of female independence and all those things. But I will say that there is some evidence that points to things like witchcraft that might have taken place in the Estrado because it is such a private place. And it often would have been through the intercession of an indigenous or African servant who would have likely been able to, or would be summoned to kind of, oftentimes it was because of a husband or a lover who was, behaving in some way that was not satisfactory. And it was a way of trying to exercise control on your life. And it's really interesting because this practice was also really associated with chocolate, which was very much actively consumed in the Estrado and, of course, associated with the New World, specifically Mexico. But, more traditionally, you have the display of, religious iconography. Here we have an example of a ivory statue from Goa of Christ the Good Shepherd. And another historical text that I referenced in my research describes these religious statues that were found in these display cabinets in the Estrado. And he says that they were so lifelike that it was almost as though they had been silenced, not that they could not speak. So talking kind of, speaking to the craftsmanship of these objects that would have been found in the Estrado. And of course, we have reliquaries from different periods that reflect these objects of value that women would have worn or displayed in the Estrado. And rock crystal was often used as a window so you could kind of see the relic inside. However, we're not really sure what particular relic is in these two particular pieces, but very interesting. And here we have a young lady from Peru who is drinking out of her mate cup. And it shows she's a very large crucifix that she's wearing. And again, shows the importance of religious life as intertwined with the secular life that would have been part of your daily life in the Hispanic world in the early modern period. And she's using the different kind of silver pieces that you would have used to drink mate, which often took place in the Estrado. And speaking to the question of whether the Estrado was a place of confinement or a place of escape and relative freedom, and this ambivalence, I found a book called La Virtud en el Estrado that was published in the late 18th century. And it translates to the virtue in the Estrado. And the author, it's kind of a behavioral guide. And the author laments that women are leaving the home and, behaving like they've lost the virtue and the piety and the modesty that, is encouraged. And there's a great quote where he says, God says, "Have you daughters? Then take care of them and guard them." That is, the interpreters say, do not let them leave the house or wander about the city. Not only is it disgraceful for a dignified woman, it is also the sign of a loose woman. So this speaks to the fact that the Estrado was truly a place where elite women who, essentially in the early modern period, if you were wealthy, you probably weren't going to be seen outside without your retinue of servants. It just wasn't something that you had to do because you didn't have to leave the home to earn an income and support your family. So it was a sign of wealth and a status symbol to be able to be in your house all day. And so, again, it's a very complicated space. So it's interesting how the Estrado was used in this behavioral guide to try to dictate to women and talk about how important it was to keep your daughters within the home because lest they, go out and behave like wanton hussies. And here in this particular section, we explore the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which consists of Mexico and parts of the Caribbean. And this incredible ceramic piece is from Puebla, Mexico, and we have, of course, very rich inspiration derived from blue and white porcelain from China. And the national symbol of Mexico, of course, is the eagle with the snake on top of the cactus. And here we actually have a crane on top of a nopal cactus. So the influence of these pieces of blue and white porcelain that are coming in through the Manila galleons, through the Philippines, is clearly seen in this piece, which dates to about 1700. So, we obviously all know about Delft and, the tin glazed earthenware that's emulating the true porcelain that's being produced in Jingzhou in China. But there's also a really rich tradition in Puebla, Mexico, that is actually contemporaneous with Delftware. So it's really cool. And here we have a sewing box. Of course, needlework would have been a very important activity that would have taken place in the Estrado. And the iconography is very interesting. There's some kind of elopement scene or kidnapping that's taking place in the background. There's a very similar example to this box that is in the collection at LACMA. And I believe there's another one at the Museo Franz Mayer in Mexico City. But you see this early 19th century dress that's very typical of the period. And this likely would have been commissioned perhaps as a wedding gift again for a woman to use in her estrado. And here we have another example of lacquer that would have been produced in the Spanish Americas. This time it's from Mexico. And it's possible that some of the detail has been lost, but you can kind of see the outlines of the figures. Of course, the red ground is, reminiscent of lacquer from China. And the edge seems to be kind of like a bobbin lace design, which would have been very typical. And here on the right, we have a beaker. It's from Tonalá in Jalisco in Mexico. And these wares were called bucaros de India. And there's a very, very rich literary tradition from the Golden Age that describes the practice of women breaking these into shards and eating them. It was considered very trendy for elite women to do this in like the 17th century. And in fact, one of the most famous Spanish paintings, Las Meninas by Velázquez, depicts the Infanta being presented on a silver platter with a bucaro, which is very similar to the one in our collection. And again, like glimmers of female agency, very exciting. So women would break these pieces apart and they would gain this fashionable, deathly pallor because of, the hard metals and all the toxic material that would have been inside this kind of clay, red slipped earthenware. And but it also kind of became a way of having proto birth control, essentially, because it was so bad for you that it would cause women to stop menstruating. So again, glimmers of agency in the weirdest places. But again, there's a very, very rich literary tradition from some of the most famous Spanish writers of the 17th century. Lope de Vega talks about, these women collecting these bucaros and just eating them, and it becomes like such an obsession. It's kind of, I think the closest thing that you could compare it to maybe is like consumption in the 19th century and how that deathly pallor was very fashionable and very chic. So a little rabbit hole that's very interesting and fun to go down. And here we have the Mexican interpretation of the mahogany Chippendale chairs. Of course, mahogany coming from likely the Caribbean. These actually are a combination of Queen Anne and Chippendale styles. And the Estrado had a specific design vocabulary that referenced, that was very much associated with women. And often you would have these like miniature versions of chairs like these two examples, and they would be called muebles de ratones, which actually translates to mouse furniture, which is really charming. And so you would have like small scale mahogany pieces in current styles. So with, cabriole legs and things like that, that would have been used by women. And this is actually from the Museo de America, but here's just an illustration of kind of the smaller Estrado furniture that would have been in the same style that would have been popular at the time. So, mahogany, Mexican Chippendale. And in these casta paintings or genre paintings from the period, you often see Estrado scenes where the woman is sitting with a child on the Estrado rug or on, like in this case, a piece of Estrado furniture. And then the man is kind of off to the side. He's like the interloper and she's kind of speaking to him. So it's really interesting how there's this almost like stage, like dramatic ritual that was associated with the Estrado. Like this was her space and then he could only enter if he was invited to. So back to the title of the exhibition, A Room of Her Own, which is really cool to think about. And here we have a folding screen in the background. Empire style from probably about 1820 from Mexico. And again, you can see the influences from engravings, very idyllic scenes in the background with the very empire style motifs and the very rich colors. And earlier Estrados might have had like tapestries to decorate and warm up the space. But as we get into the 17th and 18th century, you have these biombos. The name biombo comes from the Japanese biobu, which refers to the paneled screens that would have basically stopped drafts. So biobu meaning like referring to the wind and stopping the wind. And so they had a practical but also decorative purpose. And the biombos had like a specific iteration that would have been found in the Estrado that might be lower with more panels called a Estrado. So there are different kinds of varieties that you might see. And of course, needlework, we have this beautiful sampler from 1747 by a young woman named Carlota Riveros, and different kinds of examples of her cross stitch and needlework. We have a little mermaid here. We have a bird. Really interesting to see all these different motifs together. And here we have Doña María Catalina de Urrutia. And she was the daughter of the governor of Havana, and she's painted here. She's living in Puerto Rico, and she's painted by the famous Puerto Rican artist Jose Campeche. And she's wearing two watches, which was a big status symbol at the time. And she's dressed very fashionably. This is from 1788. She's dressed very fashionably in this Louis XVI era, style that's English inspired. So you see definitely like examples of the Hispanic world being quite on the cutting edge of fashion, which is sometimes something that people don't realize. And we enter here this last section of the exhibition, which is supposed to represent kind of the end of the Estrado into the 19th century. And we have a carpet from 1766 that says, "Soy de Ana Segura." This is from the Granada region, so mid-late 18th century. And this was either commissioned or produced specifically for Ana Segura. It is also possible that she wove this herself, but very remarkable that it says in the center, it's inscribed literally, "I belong to Ana Segura," with the date. So pretty cool to have a woman, so proud of her work, or so proud to own this rug that this would have been something that she puts her name dead center as part of the design. And behind it, we have an I think this is probably my favorite piece in the exhibition, this absolutely incredible headboard that is in the Olot style that you would have seen in Catalonia, but this is probably from Andalusia in Spain. And we have the Virgin and Child. And likely this specific Madonna and Child would have been a protector of pregnant women, of women giving birth. And of course, during this time period, women would have given birth at home in their bed. So this was likely commissioned by a very wealthy woman, or perhaps her husband, but for a woman to use in her home when giving birth. Really spectacular. And the painting itself is also very unique because it's dated from 1702. It was painted by a Spanish woman painter named Maria Villamor. And she was, again, active in the early 18th century in Andalusia. And she probably worked in a workshop, perhaps run by her father or her brothers. But it is rare to find Spanish female painters from this period that we know, produced this work. So really incredible piece and very exciting to have in the show. Very Baroque, very opulent. And of course, we can't talk about Spanish female patrons without the Duchess of Alba, who was perhaps one of the most famous patronesses of the arts of her day. And she has this very authoritative pose. She has the red sash of her husband, who had recently died when this portrait was commissioned, from his military uniform. And she's very authoritatively pointing at the ground that says, Solo Goya, of course, referring to the painter himself. So this is one of the treasures from our collection. With her beautiful mantilla, she's dressed as a maja in the traditional Spanish style. But yeah, she's pretty cool. And I mentioned before a little bit about the chocolate, but chocolate would have been something that was consumed by both men and women, but was often considered an expensive vice that was kind of, foisted upon women, that was associated with feminine weakness for, sweets and things like that. And it would have been likely sweetened with a little bit of sugar, with different spices. And these different forms that you see here are called mancerinas. And the name likely originates to the Marquis de Mancera in the 17th century, who had Parkinson's, and so his hands would shake. And so the little vessel, the little thing in the middle, would have held the cup called the jicara and prevent it from slipping out of his hand. So it's an interesting example of disability-focused design, because it had a functional purpose in terms of trying to help with his hand tremors. That's the story. We don't know if it's necessarily true, but it's a compelling one for sure. And of course, these pieces are influenced by Chinese imports of porcelain. These are tin glazed earthenware, again, produced in the Royal Manufactory of Alcora in Spain, and a snuff box over here. So these are all late 18th century examples. And as we get into the 19th century in Spain, you see the Estrado, it becomes less fashionable and is phased out by the late 18th century, certainly into the 19th century. And then in the Spanish Americas, there's textual evidence of the Estrado still continuing in more rural areas of Chile, of Ecuador, well into the mid-19th century. So it's interesting how it's, becomes unfashionable as these new, more comfortable furniture forms like the canapé, the settee, come in from England and France, and the drawing room becomes very chic. And so this kind of old-fashioned Hispano-Moresque, tradition basically falls from the face of the earth. And so you see in some late 19th century texts that are very nostalgic describe the Estrado as a very opulent place, but it generally just kind of falls out of use. And here we have some examples of Spanish drawing rooms. These are two paintings from 1873. And you see elements of the Estrado that still continue. These, the Japan being very fashionable after the mid-19th century, with the reopening, of course, being a really big influence. But you have the paneled screen, like the biombo, the little Moroccan table, the lacquered cabinets. So it is kind of a continuation of the Estrado tradition, very textile rich, without it being an Estrado. But it's still, a room of her own, essentially. And I think that pretty much concludes the exhibition. Thank you so much for joining me.